Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Ken. Ken, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yes, indeed, Robbie. Great to be with you and your listeners. And I'm Ken Robison. It's that name that doesn't have the N in the middle, so it's not Robinson. And as a Robertson yourself, you probably know that you get that name Robinson pretty often. Well, I'm a lifelong Montanan, although I spent almost 30 years out of Montana for my long period of service in the U.S. Navy during the Cold War. And I was raised on a farm, like so many other Montanans that were sons or grandsons, in my case, of homesteaders, that big homesteading era that populated Montana in the early 1900s. And brought all sorts of people from all over the world to Montana. So after the University of Montana, I headed off to the Navy, and from there it was a long career. I was able to spend the whole time in Naval Intelligence, which meant that there was never a dull moment. There were challenges, and it was exciting, whether you were in port or at sea, or whether it was sea duty or shore duty, and so on. So as a Navy officer, I retired and was able to have control of my focus and time. I moved back to Montana with my family, and here we live, able to focus on neglected Montana history, I call it, because what I did when I did return to Montana was take a close look at, what had been written and what had been researched in Montana history. And I found, the Copper Kings and the vigilantes were way overworked. So many books, so much time and attention on them. Not that they weren't important, but they weren't the only part of Montana history. So I started looking for neglected Montana history. Stood out very clearly that Black history, African-American history, had been totally neglected in Montana. And of course, the excuse I got from the very beginning was, well, the numbers were so few. But that didn't explain it to me, because I kept running across these really profound stories, important stories to Montana history that involved African Americans. And, York with the Lewis and Clark expedition may have been the first Black in Montana, but there were Blacks in every aspect of Montana history, and some of the great stories I've uncovered and so on. And another aspect I found that had been superficially covered, Custer did the military side of Montana history, military history. And I thought, let's look a little deeper. What's been neglected? Well, the Civil War's 150th anniversary rolled around in 2011. And of course, I looked very closely to see what was Montana going to do. And again, I got the excuse, well, there were no big battles fought in Montana, so we don't care about Civil War history. Well, that was a bad answer, because all I could think of was almost every resident of Montana, whether it was Montana as a territory was formed during the Civil War, and whether it was during the Civil War or right after the Civil War, every person, man, woman, and child, had been profoundly influenced, whether they'd fought or whether they'd been, like one of the young men I wrote about was a 16-year-old in Vicksburg on the Confederate side, and he endured that long, painful siege that General Grant imposed on Vicksburg before it was captured, and the fact that the Western Theater and the importance of the Mississippi River control and all of these things, they'd also been kind of neglected. But in any case, that led me to the next big anniversary. So actually, with the Civil War, I wrote 3 books about Montanans and their experiences in the Civil War, whether they were in combat, as so many were, but they might have been a young teacher from Illinois who was sent down by the Freedmen's Bureau, which was that organization created by Congress late in the war in 1864 to go into the parts of the South that had been captured by the Union, so quote, occupied Union territory, and try to do everything they could to help the slaves. In her case, there were millions of slaves being freed, and they had nothing. They had no education, they had no jobs, they had virtually no clothing on their except what was on their backs. And this young woman from Illinois was recruited to go down to occupied Mississippi, and it was quite the story that I uncovered, including letters that she had sent back that I'd found at the Montana State University special collection in Bozeman, Montana, would of all places. And as I wrote that into the first of my books, because I wanted to present several of the women that had, in some cases, they'd been spies, or in the case of this young woman, she'd been a very important player with the Freedmen's Bureau. At the point where my book was published, I was taking it around the state, and I was over in Missoula, Montana, giving a talk and signing books. And this woman and her husband came up afterward, and she said, I'm a direct descendant of that Freedmen's Bureau teacher, and I didn't know anything about this, and how wonderful to find out. And so I told her how to get to the series of letters at the library in Bozeman. And in return, she had the diary that her husband, this teacher's husband, had kept during his combat period. So she shared that. And it's been like that with each of my books. The next anniversary, though, just to briefly skim through, was, of course, the centennial of the Great War, the First World War. And again, I looked to see what was going to be done in Montana, and it wasn't very much. And so, and no books previously had been published on Montanans and their experiences in World War I, both at home and those that served overseas. So that led me to 2 books in that case to cover the subject. So I guess I would, end my introduction by saying, if it's been neglected in Montana history, I seek it out and try to do justice to it by writing about, researching it, writing about it, and then taking it around the state to interest people in that neglected story.
Every state probably has, I mean, they have one thing that usually gets mentioned. Like Maryland's known for crabs, and there's like a bunch of like this odd off stuff, but there's actually deeper history, which is interesting. I'm glad that you look at like the neglected history aspects of stuff, because I came across one of your books, and it was the Cold War in Montana. And I'm just curious, what was Montana's involvement into the Cold War? Because it's an area where, like I said, my generation's probably disconnected from the fear of a nuclear winter. There's talks about it, but honestly, it's more cyber threats, if anything, that we will probably be dealing with today. But we're disconnected from this era of communism. We're disconnected from these things that used to be. I mean, people were knocking on doors, selling bomb shelters. Kids were hiding under desks thinking it would protect them from a nuclear bomb. Like, that's real, and that was a part of our history, and we don't experience that today. So my generation's completely disconnected. And with this whole Kennedy rabbit hole I've been going down, leading into the Nixon administration and a bunch of things, I've started had a fascination for history, and I would really want to know what your book, The Cold War in Montana, was about.
Cold War Montana came about because on the one hand, I'd spent almost 30 of my years during the Cold War. And you can sort of begin the Cold War where you want to begin it. Some people go back to World War One and our intervention in Russia toward the end of the war, when the Tsarist government had been overthrown by a social democrat group, and in turn, in the fall of 1917, that social democrat government of Kerensky was overthrown by Bolsheviks. Well, Bolsheviks had a kind of a lineage from Karl Marx and his brand of communism. It was fostered by Lenin, and began this turning Russia from a czarist government to a Bolshevik revolutionary government. And with that came the philosophy of international communism. So it wasn't just imposing communist, or in this case, Bolshevik rule in the early years in Russia, but it was imposing communism worldwide as a philosophy and as a a goal. And so some people go back that far. In my case, I go back to World War II, because that's when we formed that alliance of urgent need with the Soviet Union during the early 1940s. And it was when the US began building an army before we got in the war. As we've traditionally done, we've had a very small standing army and a fairly strong navy, but in this case, it was nothing adequate to begin to engage in all that was happening in World War II, both with the Japanese Imperial Empire in the Far East and the Nazi German war machine in Europe. So by the time the Nazis had conquered most of Europe and the Japanese had began their expansion, bringing us into the war, we formed this urgent alliance with Joseph Stalin. And, the whole wartime atmosphere was a smiling Joe Stalin, our ally, holding off the German hordes on the Eastern Front until we could build up an army and be in a position where we could open a Western front by invading France and Italy. And that, that's the background. Well, that temporary alliance, of course, was only that because even during the war, the Soviet Union, with the great Lend-Lease program that President Roosevelt had brought Congress to pass so that they could help keep the Soviet Union in the war, it involved Montana so directly. And that was sort of the beginnings of Montana's direct involvement in what became the Cold War. Because during World War II, I talk in the book about a little Christmas magic, because right after Pearl Harbor, there was this urgent need to build up military facilities around the US, both for Army expansion, but also for a great expansion of our Army Air Corps. It was in those days, because that was before the creation of a separate Air Force. So let's call it the Air Force to simplify. And so a delegation went back from the city of Great Falls in Montana, and they expected to receive news of whether Great Falls, Montana was going to be one of those bases that was selected to be formed as an Air Force base. And the news came when they landed that the Army Air Corps had put that plan for a base at Great Falls, Montana in the dead file. Well, the leader of the delegation was this incredible mayor that he had about 9 lives himself. He'd been in the Soviet Far East in 1918, 1919, right at the end of World War I. And as we were engaging in trying to help beat down the Bolshevik threat to Russia. And here this mayor, Ed Shields, had been in the army and had served over there. Actually, he hadn't been in the army. He was a railroadman with the Great Northern Railroad and sent with army forces and a bunch of railroad men to build up the rail facilities and help the supplies and so on in the anti-Bolshevik effort. So anyway, here's old Ed Shields, now the mayor of Great Falls, leading this delegation, finding out the bad news that Great Falls was not going to receive an airbase. And he, through his persuasive powers, and they were really something, he managed to wrangle a direct meeting with the chief of staff of the Army Air Corps. And in that session, they presented their case, and great flying weather, great city support, all sorts of attractive reasons why the Air Force should put an air base at north central Montana. It was a jumping off point for Alaska. They were beginning to work on the Alaskan Highway, which jumped off from Great Falls, Montana, to go through Canada on up to Alaska and so on. So, he had a powerful set of reasons. And during that conversation, he convinced the chief of staff of the Air Force to reconsider, and he directed his staff to pull that study out of the quote dead file and re-look at whether there should be a base or not. Well, within a few months, a couple of engineers appeared on scene. Wartime secrecy meant that they didn't, simply take the stage in Washington, D.C. and announce, we're going to have an air base in Great Falls, Montana. Rather, it came very subtly by the arrival of some engineers and the beginning of selection of the location for a brand new air base in Great Falls, Montana. Not only the beginning of that air base, which became the first years of the war, it became a B-17 bomber training base, along with satellite bases in 3 other Montana towns. All of these new, of course, but it was also, Great Falls was selected to use the civil airport, Gore Hill, became Gore Field Air Force Base or Air Base. And that was to be the center for the beginning of this massive Lend-Lease program of sending bomber, fighter, transport, you name it, and we sent it to the Soviet Union. And during the course of the war, over 8,000 aircraft left Great Falls, Montana, flew to Alaska, were taken over there by Soviet pilots on through Siberia and directly into the Eastern Front to combat the Soviets or combat the Nazi invaders. And of course, at the time, the Bolsheviks, the Soviet government was going to be very quiet about the American aid. But, when the Iron Curtain fell in 1991, and we'll get to that, but when that opened up Russia to much more open dialogue with the US, it became very clear that they had been terribly dependent on that Lend-Lease aid. And many people say that both Ladd Air Force Base at Fairbanks, Alaska, and the air base that was called East Base, or Great Falls Air Base in Great Falls, Montana, were Soviet Red Army air bases during the war. They were under the control, essentially, of the Soviet military to get those aircraft winterized and remarked with Soviet markings and taken up and on their way, part of the Lend-Lease program. So, you can sort of begin with that and all of the inside part of that centered on the Russians, the Soviets, moving people in to spread around the country to spy on our industries and take back industrial secrets, and even the point of taking back secrets related to the war and military, including things like samples of heavy water and uranium and so on were found in the cargo that was being sent back, because those airplanes didn't leave empty. They left loaded with supplies. Almost all the supplies were, of course, aid supplies authorized by our government, but that small percentage, but very important percentage, were filled with diplomatic pouches with stolen secrets. So the war had already begun with the Soviet Union. We were just wartime temporary allies. And then, of course, we got off on the sequence that with the Soviet successes against the Germans, allowing the Soviet military to occupy Central and Eastern Europe, and going on into Germany, as we finally were able to get our Western front opened and invasion and marching toward the East with the British and Free French forces.
Let me just ask a quick question. When it comes to the Air Force base that's delivering, or the base that's delivering to Russia, is there a danger? And I mean, you're trying to help, but obviously it's going to be secret, because I don't think Russia wanted to know that we were giving them aid, or they didn't want other people to know that Russia was getting aid from the U.S. For war. But then another issue started to become the fact that when we were sending their supplies, they were also being able to go through our supplies and be able to look through and get more information on us as well too. Because it's friendly during war, but what happens when you're not in war any longer? Then it becomes what it's always been, which is like this intelligence kind of hunt or espionage tactics that start to happen.
Well, that's right, and fortunately, there was the American, the U.S. Air Force, or Army Air Corps. Again, we're still in the pre-Air Force period. George Racy Jordan, Major Jordan, was a very bright guy, and he'd been an aviator in World War One. He was very experienced, had been a businessman, a very successful businessman, was brought back on active duty for World War II and put in charge of the Lend-Lease program on the American side in Great Falls, Montana. And Major Jordan kept diaries. He in a number of cases broke those diplomatic seals and opened, and that's how we have the direct evidence of the extent of the spying that was going on. So, I don't want to make too much of this World War II lead in, because that is exactly what it was, the lead in to the Cold War, because as the Soviets occupied Central and Eastern Europe, and with their military were able to impose communist governments on each of the countries, all of the countries except Austria, and for a while, for a couple of years, Czechoslovakia avoided it, but then the Soviets were able to take that over too. And so let's begin at that point. And by 1946, because of this Soviet occupation and imposition of satellite governments in those Central and Eastern European countries, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, our great wartime ally in Britain, had recognized exactly what the Soviets were doing. And in a speech in Fulton, Missouri, with President Truman present, Premier Churchill gave this Iron Curtain speech when this famous speech where he said there's an Iron Curtain descending on Europe, on Eastern Europe, and went on to make it very clear that he was talking about the Soviet Union and their new satellites. Well, in response, of course, we were beginning to, we had drawn down our forces greatly, as had the other allies. The Soviets, of course, had not. So we began to get very concerned about how far the Soviet control was going to go. And because in countries like France and Italy, even though they emerged from the war with democratic governments, much the strongest factions in many areas in both France and Italy and some of the other countries in Western Europe were communist led. The communist wartime resistance units had been very strong, very well organized, and had gained great credibility with the population because they'd been so active in opposing German occupation and leading the resistance. So, we began to get concerned about not only Central and Eastern Europe, but the takeover of Western Europe. And the first showdown came in Greece when the communist uprising tried to seize control. Well, the British traditionally have had sort of Greece as a protectorate under them, but Britain emerged from World War II so weakened financially and militarily, for that matter, that we had to step in. That's when the Truman Doctrine came out, and we began the Marshall Plan, and we began urgently trying to rebuild the economies and a military presence of both ourselves and these Western European countries to begin to hold back and check the spread of international communism, because their movement was moving rapidly, and we had to work hard to stalemate it. And of course, then things like the Berlin blockade began. The first step, though, was the Berlin Airlift, because in 1948, the Soviet Union's puppet government in East Germany. Germany had been divided into 4 zones under the 4 allies, with the 3 Western allies cooperating with each other, but the Soviets and their East German puppet government having control of a very important part of Berlin, as well as much of the eastern part of Germany. And that government declared that there'd be no canal, rail, or road traffic into Berlin. Well, a good section of Eastern Germany separated Berlin from Western Germany, where the Allies had their zones. So the US, again, a very important decision immediately made by President Truman was to supply the West Berliners, who were surrounded by East German and Soviet forces, but by air, there was still an agreement in writing with the Soviet Union, so they couldn't shut down air traffic, but they didn't think there was any chance the Western Allies would be able to supply, I think it was something like 2.5 million West Berliners, especially since winter was coming, and coal, fuel, and food was going to be needed in such big supply. Well, the U.S. mobilized, and one of the places they mobilized, because at the end of the war, the decision was made while many bases around the U.S. were decommissioned, no longer needed by the new Air Force. But Great Falls, Montana had been pegged as one permanent base. And so at the beginning of the Berlin airlift, the Air Force selected Great Falls Air Base as the training place for all the replacement crews and pilots going over to the Berlin airlift. So, and initially the pilots and crews were already in position in Germany, but with the few that were there, they could only sustain a few months of operation before they were exhausted and needed replacement. So that whole Berlin airlift, they called it Operation Vittles, was centered right here in Great Falls, Montana, training those replacement air crews. And that continued for the year and a half of that Berlin airlift. And by then we were well into a Cold War. It was recognized by both parties in the U.S. One of the things that we emerged from World War II with was a fairly close working relationship in international relations between Republicans and Democrats. And even though it might be a Republican Congress from 1948 and a Democrat President Truman, they both agreed that these moves that Truman was making, like the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, and so on, were critical to US national security in the long run. So then began the first of the two great proxy wars, where Joe Stalin was pulling the strings from behind the Iron Curtain. And the first string he had pulled, and the first mistake he made, really was the Berlin Airlift, because he and his Soviet military leadership totally miscalculated the US and British ability to supply Berlin and sustain it for an extended period. And what that meant, of course, was that Joe Stalin made a huge mistake, because out of the Berlin airlift and that blockade came the movement toward a strong West Germany government and the formation of NATO out of the Western allies. And it probably would not have happened, or at least not nearly as soon as it did happen in the late 40s, if the Berlin blockade hadn't been, that is, the formation of a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which meant there was a formal military and civilian organization focused on stopping the spread of international communism and the Soviet Union in Europe. Joe Stalin's second big mistake was in giving the green light to the North Koreans. Korea is too complex a World War II and post-World War II situation to cover in any sort of detail right now, except to say that Korea had emerged from Japanese occupation in World War II into two zones. The northern part of Korea was sort of a client state of the Soviet Union, and the southern part of Korea was bringing in a democratic republic under Syngman Rhee and sort of American sponsorship. And some US troops, a very small element, were stationed in Korea. By the late 40s, it looked like they were going to let both North and South Korea free themselves from direct occupation by either the Soviets or US forces, and that was happening. Well, the mistake that Stalin made was giving North Korea the green light to invade the South in June of 1950. And North Korea had promised Joe Stalin that within days, their powerful tank armored columns would be able to break through and sweep through South Korea and occupy South Korea. And that almost happened. And it would have happened if we hadn't had occupation forces in Japan still at that time in 1950. We had a couple of divisions still in Japan as post-war occupation. And so we were able to shift quickly enough forces from that occupation force, like the 24th Infantry Division, into that shrinking perimeter in South Korea that we were holding from North Koreans' assault. So let's cut with that first proxy war, except to say that, again, the decision Truman made with bipartisan support to come to the aid of South Korea and stop the North Korean advance was a huge step in the Far East in the beginning of that aspect of the Cold War. And of course, you go on from there all the way through the 1950s and into things like the threat of Russian bombers coming over the horizon into attack American cities. And of course, the Soviet Union, because of stolen secrets, had been able to develop an atomic bomb and nuclear capability within a year or so by the end of the war. So the U.S. emerged from World War II as the sole nuclear power, but the Soviet Union rapidly broke that and was able to have the
That was our biggest gun too, was the nuclear bomb, and so they ended up
well, that
figuring out
was
how to
what
make.
was holding back the Soviet invasion, we think, of Western Europe at the end of the war, because with our nuclear capability and in that first year after the war, the Soviet Union didn't have it. But anyway, into the early 50s, when the Soviet Union also followed us not too far behind with the hydrogen bomb. So they had uh, kind of parity in that terrible destructive power of nuclear. And
It's a store brand. It's a store brand.
yeah, and so through the 50s, of course, Alaska was important, and Great Falls Air Base was the jumping off point. They'd have drills where they'd literally um, send an entire infantry division by air from Great Falls, Montana into Alaska by, using airlift capability. It was huge, hugely important. So it wasn't just the Berlin airlift transport, but also this reinforcing Alaska in case of war. And it was also the defense of northern North America from Soviet bomber attack equipped with nuclear and hydrogen weapons. And that meant a series of satellite bases in places like Glasgow and as well as Great Falls. So Great Falls remained important in the national defense program. Space race began, and on into the election of Kennedy and that whole era of beginning his shaky tenure in office with the Soviets imposing the Berlin Wall, and also moving toward a I'm losing my thought, but anyway, the Soviets, by moving medium and intermediate range missile nuclear capability into Cuba. Well, that of course led to something that I think even you youngsters have heard about, and that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of all the period of the Cold War from, let's say, the end of World War II until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the closest we came to a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union was undoubtedly the Cuban Missile Crisis. And one aspect of that I write about in the book that we didn't fully understand until the fall of the Soviet Union, and again the Russians opening up and opening their archives and sharing what had been very tightly held secrets with us. That the fact that a Soviet Foxtrot submarine, one of their conventional diesel submarines equipped with nuclear torpedo capability, almost fired a nuclear torpedo at U.S. naval ships that were imposing that naval blockade on Cuba to make sure that the no more nuclear weapons came in and the ones there were withdrawn. And so the combination of the Cuban Missile Crisis and that one incident with a near firing of a nuclear weapon by a Soviet Foxtrot that I write about in my book meant that we came very close to war. We went on through the rest of the 60s, of course, very exciting time, the moon shot, and to the space program on the US side and to the astronauts. And I found, in every case, I knew, I knew because I'd been involved and had of course, been in naval intelligence. I knew what was happening internationally in essentially every aspect and every stage of the Cold War. What I hadn't really known was what was happening in Montana during this whole period. And so the great fun I had, and full Cold War was by no means fun at the time, but the fun I had was finding the stories. I mean, stories like the great astronaut Frank Borman, who was in on that Apollo 8 flight, and the Christmas Eve broadcast to the American people that I want to mention a little more in a bit. But Frank Borman, after his astronaut days, bought a ranch in Montana and lived for decades in Billings, Montana. And, that's the kind of story I was looking for, because I wasn't going to exaggerate or make up Montana's involvements or the involvement of Montanans in the Cold War. I didn't have to. I kept running across the stories like this. Back to the Soviet occupation of Central and Eastern Europe, I found this Army officer he was from Lewistown, Montana, and he had been converted from military to State Department, which was highly unusual during his career in Austria with the military, with the US military government. And Austria, unlike the other countries, it hadn't been only occupied by the Soviets. It was occupied both the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. And then they formed a series of agreement, and they had like a four-party of the Allies meeting to decide things and the future of Austria. And this Montanan was so skilled as both a military officer and a diplomat that he was able, of course, with other participation, to keep the Soviets from taking over Austria. It's just an astounding story. And I had known absolutely nothing about it until I started research for this book. So, I could find even a few international stories that I hadn't been aware of at the time that involved Montanans, but mainly it was things like all through the 50s until the US Air Force had the technology and the money to build the very sophisticated radar detection systems like the distant early warning and the other systems that we put along the northern corridor of the US. The Air Force formed a program called Operation Skywalk, and it was all along the northern US, but let's center just on Montana. In Montana, the Air Force had recruited some 11,000 Montanans, and they were on ranches. They were school kids in Missoula or at the Blackfeet Reservation in around Browning. They were all sorts of people, but there were people that volunteered that whenever they heard an aircraft, they would immediately go out, try to pick it up visually. They had identification cards and they had phone numbers. The phone numbers were to filter centers in Billings and Helena, two places in Montana. And if you were on a farm, as some friends of mine from childhood actually had been, and they were part of that 11,000 army of civilians as part of Operation Skywatch, they would go outside, identify the aircraft as best they could, call the filter center, and in most cases, of course, the filter center would know of a commercial aircraft or of U.S. aircraft activity out of Malmstrom or Great Falls Air Base. By the way, Great Falls Air Base was renamed Malmstrom Air Force Base in the 1950s, mid 50s. So I'll talk back and forth between those two names, but
Well, that's fascinating that Operation Skywatch. You had like kids involved. I mean, it was the whole all 11,000 something people. You just, hey, this is a little thing we got to do. As it's like a patriot kind of act in a way. You're a patriot. You're helping out your country by, yeah.
It absolutely was, and it meant that so many people bought into national defense, and they, 11,000 in some states might not be a huge, number,
It's
but
pretty big.
in Great Falls, in Montana, in those days, Montana had about 600,000 people. So we're talking about a sizable slice of the population, and it was spread all through. And in some cases, of course, their call would lead to the launch of alert fighters out of either Spokane, Washington, if it was Western Montana, or out of Great Falls or Malmstrom Air Force Base if it was in Central Montana, and so on. So that Operation Skywatch continued through most of the 1950s. Um, but of course, by the early 60s, in addition to the Cuban Missile Crisis, we began to enter the second big proxy war, and that was Vietnam. And again, most of you youngsters, in addition to the Cuban Missile Crisis, have probably heard of the Vietnam War because of your fathers or mothers and others that are close to you having served. So many from the U.S. served during the Vietnam War. So I cover that very important war. That was kind of the heart of when I was serving on active duty, and I spent most of my time, 11 of my almost 30 years in the Navy were aboard ship, aboard aircraft carriers, uh, doing my intelligence thing. And during the Vietnam War, of course, that meant being a very engaged and a part of the the naval air contribution to either bombing North Vietnam during periods when uh, the bombing was authorized, or providing close air support or fighter support in South Vietnam. But so it was a tremendously active period for the whole U.S. military, and I found cases where Montanans, in one case, a Montanan before the buildup of U.S. forces in South Vietnam, he had been stationed at the Military Advisory Group in 1962, and one of his jobs was to teach English. Uh, because of course the language barrier was great early in the days before our presence was heavy in South Vietnam. And he had been off one day on the outskirts of Saigon and had been captured by what were really the Viet Cong in the early stages in 1962. And he was held for 6 months and finally released. So, again, I found stories like that of Montanans that were engaged overseas, but uh, also those what was happening, like that Operation Skywatch that was happening in Montana. I looked very closely at the prisoners of war. That was a subject very close to my heart because during Operation Homecoming, which was in early 1973, um, both the Navy and the Air Force had trained people like me that were spread around the world. I happened to be at that time on Yankee Station off Vietnam when the bombing halt came, and the ceasefire that had been agreed to in Paris. And so it became clear by early February that the North Vietnamese were going to release the U.S. prisoners of war that had been held in Hanoi. Most of them Navy Air Force pilots that had been shot down. Um, so I was flown off the carrier to Clark Air Force Base, where we held Operation Homecoming, and I was there when the first three C-141s flew in um, from Hanoi with prisoners of war on board, including the one I was assigned to was uh, then Captain James Bond Stockdale, who later was a two-star admiral eventually before he retired. And we called him CAG Stockdale. That's Carrier Group Commander, and that's what he was when he was shot down. He was one of the senior Navy POWs that had been shot down, and he, along with one Air Force officer, had been the primary leaders of the POWs. And the POWs tried to form a very ironclad resistance to interrogation and all of the, torture and the other very difficult environment they were in with the North Vietnamese. Um, so I'd lived with his story. I'd spent 2 months with him, debriefing him. He went on to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for the leadership of the POWs in that very, very difficult early several years of captivity. But I also looked at others, the Montana POWs, and only two were attributed to Montana because you had to enter the Air Force. I mean, there were certain rules of who constituted a Montana POW. Well, there were two, but I found a third that was fascinating, and I consider him every bit a Montanan because Colonel Fred Van Cherry, who was shot down in 1965, another very early shoot down like Stockdale had been. He was African American, and Major Cherry at the time was shot down, almost killed by injuries on ejecting his fighter plane, and captured by the North Vietnamese, thrown into prison. And the North Vietnamese were going to try to play the race card. They were very attuned to the race riots and the very difficult racial situation of the 1960s in the U.S. and the fact that with the 1964 Voting Rights Act, and again I talk about that because Montanans played a very interesting role in the passage of that 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that followed. And anyway, Colonel Cherry, almost near death, very, very badly wounded from his ejection. The North Vietnamese said, aha, we're going to put this young Navy ensign from Alabama in his cell, this white guy. And so young ensign Porter Halliburton was literally thrown into Cherry's cell. And they were just waiting, the North Vietnamese were just waiting for the racial sparks to fly. Well, they didn't fly. And in fact, it's an amazing story. And I tell the story in the book, but there's also another great book by the two, by Porter Halliburton and Fred Van Cherry, called Two Souls Indivisible, that tell their story about being in that cell together with Cherry, an absolute invalid. He was unable to feed himself. He couldn't, he just couldn't do anything. And Porter Halliburton, this young ensign, was deeply depressed by the capture and the initial torture he'd received. And the two of them started interacting, and Porter Halliburton feeding and caring, changing the wounds, doing all the things he could. I get a bit emotional about this story. Anyway, to keep Major Cherry alive, and at the same time, because his total focus and devotion was to Cherry and to his mission, it kept him going, and he overcame his depression. I mean, he had a mission in life, and it was more than just resisting more torture and more difficult living conditions and all the things he knew he was going to endure. He was literally keeping this American alive, and that's what happened. And for 9 months, Cherry increasingly got better and better, and for 9 months, they bonded. Became very clear to the North Vietnamese eventually that their racial ploy had just flat failed, and actually, I mean, they were split up and didn't see each other until Operation Homecoming, when they had a great reunion, and from then on, for the rest of their lives, they had they had a very close relationship. They wrote the book together. They went on speaking tours all around the country, especially to youth groups, and so, I mean, it's just one of these powerful stories. Now, my reason for saying that Fred Venturi was a Montanan was the fact that Fred had grown up on a sharecropper's farm in Virginia, very close to Langley Air Force Base, and also the Navy bases at Hampton Roads and on the Virginia coast. And
It's an hour away from me.
he was hearing both Navy and aircraft planes doing maneuvers over their farm, and as a boy growing up, and he swore, that's where I'm going. And of course, he was growing up in the 1940s, um, until 1948, when President Truman signed the executive order that integrated the armed forces. Cherry would have had a very slim possibility for serving in aviation, but of course it did get signed. The executive order did integrate the armed forces. It did lead the way for the country. And Cherry, through his persistence, he was turned down by the Navy recruiter. He was turned down initially by Air Force recruiters, but he was very persistent. And finally, an Air Force recruiter, sort of probably thinking, well, I'll just get rid of him because he won't be able to pass the test. By then, Cherry had gone through a segregated college, and so, he was educated, but he was also a very bright guy. And he aced the test. He got the best score in the group that was taking it that day, and they'd sent him to officer candidate school and then to aviation training, and he became one of the first black pilots in the integrated Air Force. But along the way, in the 1950s, for 3 years, he was assigned at Great Falls Air Base. In fact, he was not only assigned there when it was Great Falls Air Base, but during the time when it was changed to Malmstrom Air Force Base. And he married a Great Falls woman. And, for those reasons, I thought I had every right to say Fred Cherry had a bit of Montanan in him. And anyway, it's a powerful story. All of the POW stories, each unique, were very powerful stories. Stockdale's was amazing. I couldn't tell a lot about any one of them, but I did tell the Montana POWs as well as Stockdale and Cherry's stories, uh, partly because how close I'd been through my service in Operation Homecoming, which was really the honor of a lifetime.
I wanted to get to you mentioned a Christmas or Christmas Eve announcement. Is that what you said it was earlier?
Well, there was a great Christmas program that the astronauts did, and this was Apollo 8 in 1968. And you have to know some about that terrible year. The year of 1968 began with the North Vietnamese seizing the Pueblo, of Navy reconnaissance spy ship, and capturing the crew. And it progressed from there to the killing of Martin Luther King, the killing of Bobby Kennedy, the disaster at the Democrat convention with the riots in the streets of Chicago. And, it went on through throughout this very complex, difficult year. And Apollo 8 was launched. That was our 8th Apollo shot with Colonel Frank Borman, Bill Anders, and a third astronaut, all being launched for the first lunar orbit. This was before we could land on the moon, but this was to be the first lunar orbit. And it was timed so that the Apollo 8 went into orbit, into lunar orbit on Christmas Eve of 1968. And the astronauts looked back on the year and thought, this has really been an awful year for the American people. Let's try to brighten the end of the year, the Christmas season, and the end of the year by having this live broadcast from space as we're in lunar orbit. So they organized their program amongst themselves, and it included some other things, but it kind of culminated with just a powerful reading from the book of Genesis. And each of the three in turn read portions of the book of Genesis. And it was just this powerful program that probably all America that could tuned in on it that night. And that was the Christmas Eve broadcast from space. It was an exciting time, that whole space race. Today it's so accepted, especially now with commercial companies as well as NASA, all working to keep active parts of the space program going. But then it was all NASA. And like everything else, I found a Montanan who'd played a very key role in NASA, and that was this guy from Black Eagle, Montana. And Black Eagle is I'd say a suburb of Great Falls. It's across the Missouri River on the north bank of the Missouri River. And it's where the great industrial part of Great Falls had been. And I've not talked about this, but Montana copper was mined in Butte, smelted in Anaconda, and refined in Great Falls, Montana, in roller mills and refineries where the copper wire came off. And there's the saying that Montana copper wired the world, and in a lot of ways it did, because most of the U.S. copper was coming out of those Butte mines, and it was coming off those roller assembly lines in Black Eagle, Montana. So Black Eagle was this working man's neighborhood full of immigrants from all over the world. And boy, if you don't think they were interested in the Cold War, because their homelands, whether it was Czechoslovakia or Romania or Hungary, all of those countries had been occupied by the Soviets. And so these immigrants and their sons and daughters by then were keenly interested in following the Cold War. And all the while, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, which was that company that was wiring the world, and that happened in World War II. The shells had copper casings and so on. So hugely important. Well, out of this immigrant community, an Italian immigrant son became the head of NASA's public relations department, Gene Marianetti, and his parents were immigrants from Italy, and it's just one of these great immigration stories. Well, Gene had been hired by NASA, and he worked his way up, and so by the time that exciting things were happening with NASA, Gene was ahead of the PR department. And so his mission was to get the astronauts out of their spacesuits and on the road to sell the space program to the American people. So Gene Marianetti, pretty amazing guy in his own right, but keeping those astronauts moving around the country, including many trips to Montana, partly because of Marionette, but also because they went to every state. They sold people in every part of the U.S. that the space program was in their interest and they needed to fund it and so on.
You
So
guys are some smooth talkers over there in Montana. You got a couple instances now where you guys have someone sales pitched or said something right that's gotten you guys something.
yeah. So the Christmas broadcast was just absolutely the tonic that helped, I think, America end that very difficult year. Um, and of course, it moves on then to into the later in the 60s. I personally I finally left the Pacific and was sent to Stockholm, Sweden, as a naval attaché, and my responsibility there, among others, you know what attachés do to represent the U.S. military and to represent their country in every every country they're assigned to. But my particular mission was to report on what was going on in the Baltic Sea and within the Soviet Navy and both the Northern Fleet and the Baltic Sea. And right after I got to Stockholm with my family for that amazing attaché tour, this Soviet destroyer unexpectedly, in the middle of their November celebration of the October, their different time situation. They called anyway. The revolution that brought the Bolsheviks to power was being celebrated, and all of a sudden that night, the Soviet destroyer got underway, and it looked like it was headed to Sweden. And the Soviets took them a little while to react. When they did react, they reacted with heavy force. They fired on it and forced it to go dead in the water. And some of their forces at sea were coming up quickly and managed to uh, to to seize the ship. Well, it turned out, and I reported quite a bit on it, which was part of my job. But it was important to understand, and we didn't fully understand until a little later, that it had actually been seized by the political commissar, a young officer, Soviet officer on that ship. And he seized it and was taking it out to the mid Baltic to broadcast to the Soviet people that their country was becoming corrupt and their economy was stagnant, and they needed to return to pure Soviet principles, pure communist principles. Well, um, that was a crack. And right after that, within a year of that, although I was on the other side of the world, this amazing young Soviet captain aviator, Viktor Belenko, took off from a base near Vladivostok in the Soviet Far East. And I mean, his squadron was supposed to have some training, and so he was supposed to be in the air. But what the rest of the squadron didn't know was he quickly dropped down to 100 feet instead of up at 15,000 or so where their training was supposed to be, and headed out over the Sea of Japan. And he made his way with about 30 seconds of fuel remaining to a very nice landing on Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan, and turned himself over to the Japanese authorities and, of course, to the US. And what he was flying was a MiG-25 Foxbat, which was the red hot new Soviet fighter that was designed to take down our B-52s and our other bomber aircraft. And we didn't know much about it at the time. Soviet secrecy was pretty effective. So what Victor Belenko was able to show and tell was just stunning. And so, as you say, well, why spend a lot of time on Victor Belenko? Because this is a book about Montanans overseas and so on. Well, during the course of the next 2 years, the CIA had Victor Belenko, and was part of the entertainment for him was to take him to different parts of the country. And they took him to southern Montana, around Bozeman, Montana, and the mountains, the great mountains in southern Montana. He loved it. They were so much like the Ural Mountains where he grew up. So Victor Belenko became later, after finishing with all the U.S. agencies, he became a Montanan. He changed his name and lived for many years.
He went full in. Okay, he went full in.
It's just absolute, these things just happen. I didn't know that until I started researching for the book, and I heard.
Something in the water there in Montana. You guys are putting something
I
in the
know
water.
it.
But Ken, man, you've given me enough of your time to talk about Cold War in Montana. I really appreciate it, man. You're very knowledgeable on this, and I think it piques interest in kids like me, younger generations as well too, to learn. And especially if you're from Montana, it's got to feel great hearing all these connections that are in there. There's that home state pride. But I really appreciate the time you've given me to be able to do my show and talk with me. Is there a place where people can find your books, and do you have a website and any other links that you'd like to promote?
Sure. The book is published by the History Press of Charleston, South Carolina. So, of course, they're a national outfit and they promote it nationally. It's on Amazon. I've got an author page on Amazon, but I've also got my own author page, which is, if you go to Google, put in Ken Robison History, or you can go directly to kenrobisonhistory.com and bring up my author website. And I talk about all 10 of my books, and the 5 I've contributed to. I've mentioned a couple of them today, but the thing about Cold War Montana, even though Montana's in the name and certainly Montanans are a focus, I tell the history of the Cold War through those stories. So, if you didn't care a thing about Montana but wanted in 250 or so pages to learn the history of the Cold War, browse through it, because these incidents I talk about, all form the pattern that became the Cold War. And of course, the great, exciting final part began with the 2 incidents I talked about of the Strozovoy, the destroyer that tried to defect, and Victor Belenko and his defection with his red hot Foxbat fighter plane. But it went on from there to what I call just this international stage, with Maggie Thatcher becoming Prime Minister of Great Britain in the late 1970s. And, even before she became Prime Minister, the Soviet Red Army newspaper had latched onto one of her anti-communist speeches and called her the Iron Lady. And so for the rest of her time in politics, Maggie Thatcher, the Iron Lady, would proudly use that name, and she'd introduce herself as, I'm in this red chiffon dress, this Iron Lady facing that Soviet threat. And so she was the first on the scene. Actually, she was the second on the scene, because first on the scene was maybe in some ways the most important, and yet, my gosh, you'd never ever guess it. And that is the Polish Pope, John Paul II. This former actor from Poland became the Pope in the late 1970s.
That's not crazy. There's a comedian that's now in charge of Ukraine, so it's not super
And
far out there.
look how Zelensky's doing in the Ukraine. Well, look how John Paul II did as Pope. One of his first actions was to fly to Poland. Now you have to understand the environment at the time. the Soviet puppet communist government was in firm control. There was no solidarity. There was no resistance movement on the surface or overtly. The Polish Pope flew to Poland, and millions came out to see him. When he kissed the ground, there were millions there. And his message was, be not afraid. And throughout that tour, it set the tone. There was such an outpouring, and it led to the formation, Lech Walesa and the others that formed Solidarity, because they were not afraid, because the Polish Pope told them not to be afraid. And that built over a several-year period into this massive worker-based anti-communist movement in Poland. Well, that was the second. Those were the two of the four players on the scene on this international stage. The third, of course, was 1980's election of Ronald Reagan. Came into office giving speeches to evangelical groups like the Evil Empire and powerful anti-communist speeches. And as he became president, his goal was to build up the military. And because he didn't believe in two of the givens for most of the Cold War. The first was MAD, mutual assured destruction. And that is, you hit our cities, we'll hit your cities. It's not worth it. He didn't believe in that. The other was the Brezhnev doctrine, because another thing that happened, I left out of that awful 1968, was the great spring uprising in Czechoslovakia. There'd been an earlier one in 1956 when I was in college in Missoula. We were marching in support of Hungarian freedom when the Hungarian freedom fighters had taken over and thrown out the communist government. And of course, Soviet troops marched in and put down the Hungarian uprising. Well, in 1968, they did the same thing in Czechoslovakia. It looked for a time like they might not, and Czechoslovakia would be able to throw out its Soviet dominated government and become a free democracy, but that didn't happen. And that was another terrible event in 1968. So also Reagan thought, as a way to get rid of mutual assured destruction, build up this anti-ballistic capability, missile capability, so no missiles could get through. Star Wars, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. And so he, partly propaganda, but partly real, because we had such great technology, and in so many ways we had leadership on a great lead on the Soviet Union in technology. And so 1973 rolled around. 1983 rolled around. I'm sorry, wrong decade. 1983 rolled around. And every year in November, NATO had this major exercise. And this year, they had the exercise, but they were going to embellish it a little by having the principal leaders in each of the countries a part of the exercise. In the past, it had been just military forces exercising. Well, the Soviets misread that embellishment and thought we were readying for a first strike. They were already paranoid because of Reagan's rhetoric and the fact that it looked like we were building up a force they couldn't keep up with, both in technology and in strength. And so that operation almost led to Soviets launching. They put on alert 50 nuclear equipped bombers and were all ready to launch them when fortunately the one of the key leaders of the exercise in the Air Force European headquarters, General Lenny Perutz, read what was happening better than most and talked the leadership into terminating the exercise a little bit early, but also making some moves that made it very clear that we were not about to launch. And, that's probably the second closest we ever came to nuclear warfare with the Soviet Union. We didn't fully understand that until the greatest spy that we ever had in the Soviet military, Gordievsky was his name, got word to us, actually got word to the British because he was working for the British, and they in turn clued us in that we had almost entered a nuclear exchange. So, it was a very dangerous period. And to add to that, President Reagan had to deal with a very aging Soviet leadership. Brezhnev died. The next leader took over and he died within a year. And that led to Reagan's quip I think it was in 1984, saying, how am I ever going to get nuclear arms agreements agreed to with the Soviets when they keep dying on me? And that was absolutely happening. Well, the good thing is the old leadership 3 in a row died off. And next on the bench, fortunately for the world, was this college educated, the first Soviet leader, and young, he was mid-50s. Leader was next in line. He took over as general secretary of the Communist Party and as the Soviet leader. And that was Gorbachev. And Gorbachev was not only college educated and younger, but Gorbachev had followed very closely in the 1970s and 60s what was happening to his country. And he agreed it was corrupt, and he agreed that the economy was stagnant, and he agreed that communism needed to be revitalized. And frankly, he was thinking much along the lines of that political commissar, the Storozhevoy, the destroyer, in trying to fix the communist government, shake it out of its corruption and stagnancy. And so Gorbachev immediately began that famous two-pronged approach, glasnost and the other one. Anyway, in essence, one was designed to open to discussion and debate, where in the past you didn't dare, because the party line was that dictated your thoughts, and no public utterance from you could possibly deviate. And he wanted an open dialogue of how the economy could be reformed, how the corruption could be stopped. Perestroika and glasnost were the two terms, and one was openness, and the other was coming to grips with these difficulties the economy was having. And to do that, he was willing to talk. And after the scare of that 1983 exercise, Reagan realized and understood that he needed to tone down his rhetoric, and especially as the new leader, Gorbachev, took over, and worked towards serious arms reduction. And that led to the meetings in Iceland. And I mean, it wasn't all sweetness and light, but they kept talking. And then things started happening as the 80s progressed with those four players on the scene: Maggie Thatcher, the Polish Pope, Reagan, and Gorbachev. And the Berlin Wall came down. And instead of moving Soviet troops across the border to reoccupy East Germany and impose an ironclad military rule, Gorbachev refused, because he was a committed communist. He wanted communism to be reformed and stayed in power, but it was not going to be with the use of Soviet military force. And that was true in each of the countries. Czechoslovakia was next, Hungary. Each of them had their own internal moments like the Berlin Wall falling. And I found this great story in Montana. The night the Berlin Wall fell, the postmaster in Missoula, Montana, who as a boy with his father had fled across the German border from communism and settled in Montana. And he had become postmaster in Missoula, Montana, celebrated the fall of the Berlin Wall, as did all of these immigrant families and their sons and daughters. And of course, once the Berlin Wall fell, and within the Soviet Union, another player, a little bit more minor, but still very important, Boris Yeltsin, came on scene, mayor of, I guess he was mayor of Moscow, and a very powerful individual who had gone through the same as Gorbachev in terms of having to bite his lip and put up with everything. But he saw that the Soviet structure had outlived its usefulness. So within 1 year from the beginning of 1991 until Christmas period of that same year, the actions of Boris Yeltsin and Gorbachev led to the dissolution, the vote of the Politburo to dissolve the Soviet Union. And what that meant was there were, in essence, I think it's 16 constituent republics like the Ukraine and Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, those Balt republics that have been forcefully held within the Soviet Empire, were all independent countries. Now, it wasn't easy, wasn't quick. How do you dump the communist government you have and the secret police you've had and move toward free and open anything? Some of those republics have been more successful than others, like the Balt republics have been quite successful. I mean, they have decent elections. They have all sorts of, they're within NATO. Ukraine's had a very difficult time. And that's a reminder that even though the Cold War ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the freedom of their satellite republics within the Soviet Union, but also in that Central and Eastern European Warsaw Pact, they were all independent countries. Not all have been terribly successful economically or politically. And in the beginning, it looked like Russia itself was headed toward a form of democracy. And yet, in the 20 years since Vladimir Putin has been increasingly consolidating his power, it's looking more and more like we're on the edge of entering another Cold War.
Yeah, let's avoid that type of talk. But Ken, I do got to wrap the show, man. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, man. I'm gonna link all your links in the description. You're very knowledgeable. I respect that. You got me gonna be doing some research over here in a minute. I'll tell you that. There are a couple things I got to look up, a couple of those incidences. But seriously, thanks again for doing the show, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank podcast.